Hopefully you got a little bit of time to think about those processes. And now I want to talk a little bit about children who struggle and maybe how we think about making sure that they have success as they engage in all of those processes and stages of writing. So let's think about who are kids with writing difficulties. Well, we know that the kids who struggle with writing don't write very much. Their compositions are shorter. They include fewer details. They include fewer story elements. They don't really have good writing strategies, so they don't know how to think about planning writing and how to go back and work with their writing to improve it. They are poor spellers. If you ask them to go back and proofread their work, often they don't find the problems with it. They have difficulty with that. Like I said, fewer number of words and sentences. And one of the things we know is that poor writers really rely on other people to solve their writing problems. And so they want the teacher or another adult to tell them what to write. Now, I know many of you are familiar with the term dysgraphia, which is a learning disability that affects students' handwriting, their spelling, and their composition skills. And I wanted to share with you a piece of writing that I also have held on to for a long time from a young man with dysgraphia. It's a personal friend of mine, her son. We worked together for many, many years. He was diagnosed as having dysgraphia when he was in about third grade and was given an Alpha Smart. At that time, I don't know if any of y'all have seen Alpha Smart. They're not used nearly as often anymore. They used to be kind of a very rudimentary word processor that children with disabilities were given to use to help with keyboarding and assist in the writing process. And, you know, for a lot of kids, my own son also had an Alpha Smart at one time that he absolutely refused to use in school because he thought it, drew attention to the fact that he had difficulties that some of his peers did not. I think one of the great things that has happened in terms of technology is that now you give a kid, an iPad, or you give with a keyboard, or you give them something that looks like a laptop computer, and then that's now considered kind of a cool thing, and probably doesn't have the same stigma attached as those old Alpha Smarts did. But when Mitchell, this young man I was talking about, was graduating from high school, his older sister, as only an older sister can do, tells him, Mitchell, no one should write their thank you notes on a computer. That's something that needs to be handwritten in order to be polite. And this is a student who had been writing everything using a keyboard for much of his life. So Mitchell sat down and set about doing his thank you notes, handwriting his thank you notes. And so I have an example here. Y'all know it was just one of those little cards. I did the front part that had his little monogrammed name on it. And then, it was folded in half. So the bottom is what Mitchell wrote, and the top is what his parents wrote to us. And I want to read you Mitchell's writing because my guess is some of you might have a hard time being able to decode this. It says, "Dear Phyllis et al., many thanks for your generous gift and kind words on my graduation day. Your friendship and counsel has been available to both my mother and to me. I wish you nothing but health, wealth, and prosperity moving forward. Mitchell Wilkinson." And I would hazard to guess that it took Mitchell a long, long time to be able to get that down on paper with his pen. And I would remind you that this is a young man who had been given a scholarship to go to Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts to work on an engineering degree. So when we talk about these types of learning disabilities, and when we talk about any disability, we need to remember that in light of all of these limitations, we also have a lot of strengths. But I thought this was one of the better examples that I have of how dysgraphia can impact an individual. And again, this young man was about 18 years old. Okay? So let's think about those issues, things that we should include in the process, the kinds of issues children have, and then these stages of writing. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through all this. It's written about extensively in your book. I think you all pretty much know what should be included at these times. But I think remembering that at pre-writing, we are planning and organizing prior to writing. And sometimes that includes deciding on a topic. I think that real important when you're setting the stage for writing that we get kids keeping track of all the things that they can write about. And sometimes it's as simple as that kid who just has to tell you something first thing every morning. Well, jot that down because you can write about it at writing time. Or let me tell you what happened on the playground today. Well, great, but jot that down because you can tell me about it in your writing. But it also involves being able to think and organize and plan our writing in advance to starting that drafting process, which many students don't do. And I would suggest that you all probably think about yourself as a writer and how often when you have a project to do, you spend some time thinking about what are the major things you want to cover and how are you going to structure those before you start actually sitting at your computer and doing some writing. Some of you may do that, some of you may not. I find that often it is a stage that I will skip, and when I do, I wind up having to go back and do more planning and then go back and do even more revising. And kids who have difficulty really struggle with this. Partly, I think, because many times they've learned, I don't have a lot to say in writing based on the experiences that they've had as writers. And so we can really talk about and create a community of authors who share ideas for topics and who share strategies for how to plan and produce writing. And hopefully you've thought about some of those things that you brainstorm, or go back and look at some of those things you brainstormed when I asked you to do that. In the composing stage, the focus is actually on the writer themselves and what they're wanting to say. And we want to take what we planned in the pre-writing stage and begin to get that down on paper. Students who have difficulty composing, have a really hard time imagining what is the purpose? Why am I writing this? And they don't think a lot about the intent of their communication. It's more like, okay, let me sit down and let me just get this finished. Okay? Kind of like I was describing myself earlier. Not enough attention on meaning, and again, too much of a focus on mechanics. I'm not going to write anything that I don't think I can spell correctly. So the classic example that people use of that is that, a child can either write, it was a ferocious Doberman pinscher, although they might not know how to spell those words. And so if they stick with what's safe and what they do feel confident about, that becomes, there was a bad dog, right? And one is clearly more colorful, more expressive, more interesting than the latter. Kids who have difficulties with composing don't have a lot of knowledge about the elements of the text structure. So they don't know that you start out by establishing, an understanding of the characters in this setting, and a problem is introduced, etc. And they really do avoid that notion of risk-taking, of going out there and taking on something that they don't have a lot of confidence about and spending the time to really work that through, okay? And so again, go back and look at your list and think about what are some things that you would suggest that you do to encourage that in the classroom. But one of the things that I will tell you that I have found is most important is providing children with time. Because it's this notion of get it done and get it finished real fast that I think puts a lot of pressure on our young writers and doesn't help them to develop that confidence to really take the time to think through what it is they need to say and get it down on paper in ways that are understandable to their readers. As we move from composing or drafting to revising, then that focus shifts from the writer to the reader. So now I'm going back and I'm looking at my work and I'm looking at it in light of what will my readers hear? What will my readers see? How will my readers process this? And so I'm thinking about sequence and structure and clarity in my work. And how can I organize it such that it will have the best impact or the most impact on the people who will read it? I have rarely seen children who struggled with writing who didn't find revision agonizing. They may not really have much of an idea of how we go about improving our writing. They have difficulty recognizing that they've got errors in word order, or that they've used the wrong word, or that their syntax has caused the sentence to be very difficult to understand. And they don't really have good strategies for going back and correcting errors. And when they do, many times if you say, go work on this some more, the things they revise aren't really the things that they need to revise. And that causes some difficulties. So I think we have to think about what do we do to really engage them in that process. A lot of it is being able to have those conferences and being able to give that feedback. And I always tell kids, read your piece to me, particularly with children who have, I would never have asked Mitchell, or I would have never sat down and tried to read Mitchell's thank you card with him sitting there next to me, because I was going to struggle, and I don't want his children to see me struggle with their reading their writing. So have them read it to you and say, wow, I really like the part about. Tell me a little more. And I can take some notes. Oh, okay. So maybe that'd be a part that you could go back and add. I was a little confused about this. Can you tell me more about what you mean? And again, we can help support students and provide some scaffolds that will enable them to go back and do some of that revision. I've done things like giving kids do not want to rewrite what they've written. So luckily now we have a lot of technology that allow kids to go in and move things around. But one of the things we can also do, even if they're just doing it with paper and pencil, is we can give them scissors and tape and say, cut it up, rearrange it, play with it to kind of see how it works better, or where, and then if you want to add something, you can just stick in another piece of paper and put it all together like that. So providing those supports so that kids really know what to change, and obviously not trying to change everything all at one time. And then once we move from that revision stage and we get the content like we like it, then we get to editing. So notice we've spent a lot of time on writing before we get to the point that we're looking at spelling, capitalization, punctuation. And I think it's real important to involving students in doing their own editing and having students. There's an example of a writing folder in your textbook. I actually have one that I've kept for a long time that I was going to show you, but I don't have it with me. But, we can keep a list of the skills students have, and they can keep that in their writing folder, and they know, okay, these are things I'm responsible for. So, for instance, each sentence should begin with a capital letter. Yep, I can go back and check that off because I know how to do that. Each sentence should end with a punctuation mark, right? But they may not be responsible for all of it. And, so for instance, if I have a child who's taken a risk and they've included dialogue in their writing, but they may not have the skills necessarily to manage quotation marks yet, well, that's something I can go back and help with. So we can work on editing as a team so that kids are asked to do the things that are within their zone of proximal development, the things that, they're ready to do or they're ready to do with the support of another person. And then there are some things that maybe they're not ready to take on, but I can help you with that part. And I've known teachers that keep hats around that say, I'm the final editor, and, so they make it clear. And one of the things that I talk with students about is, I have, when my pieces go out for publication, I have an editor that reads them through, gives them that final check over. So that's a role that, as a teacher, you can take on in your classroom. And, once kids go through and can do the things that they can do on their own, then we can go back. In terms of spelling, one thing that I have found works well, because again, students who have difficulties editing, one of the things they have is they spell poorly. And so they don't know how to find necessarily the things that they misspelled, or there are so many things misspelled that to go back and revise them all would be really difficult and wouldn't be much of a good learning process. So one of the things that I tell children to do is circle the things that you think are misspelled. Circle 5 words. Sometimes they circle things that are spelled okay, that's fine. But then almost always there's some things we can work on. And usually when a child can recognize it's misspelled, that may be a word that they're ready to learn to spell correctly. And it's probably a word that they've paid attention to and maybe are likely to use again. And then I'll go through and correct the other things, And as a teacher, you have to decide how perfect does it have to be. Obviously, with that piece of Genevieve's, the teacher decided, you know what? For this first time, we're just going to let this go like this because this has a lot of power. But your parents, your children, what should happen in your own classroom. Many times, students who have difficulties editing, they've left words out, they've omitted endings, their words are real short, they've written the wrong words. Again, we can go back and do some of that conferencing with them to help them identify some things. They've written sentence fragments. We can go through and say, I'm not sure what the end of, let's work on the end of this sentence together, okay? Or they avoid complex sentences and we can show them, you know what, you can put these two sentences together and then that becomes a really interesting sentence. We talked about capitalization and punctuation, either not using it or using it inconsistently. And again, that's something we can work with them on. I think with punctuation, most of you have probably done that, but I always tell kids, read it through and let's think about where you want me to pause. And sometimes I'll read things really fast for kids, that don't have punctuation and say, do you want me to read it like this where I never take a breath? And then we'll go back and think about where the pauses should be, and that gives us a real good idea of where to put in the punctuation. So again, think about those are some of the ideas I have. Many of you always have ideas that are wonderful that I haven't thought of. So think about, what do you do or what could you do at the editing stage to make it more comfortable and to have kids come away feeling more confident rather than, oh, I made so many errors, so I'm obviously not doing a very good job of this. And then remember, when things are published, that means that somebody's saying, I've worked on this a long time and it's ready to go. It's ready to be shared. And again, we need to make sure that it's something that can be easily read by others. And oftentimes that's something that requires the teacher and student to work on it together. And this is where oftentimes students who have handwriting challenges will really become frustrated, because teachers will say, okay, now you need to rewrite it and you need to make it look perfect. And so again, think about those ways that we can, use technology or use other supports or work with children. You write a sentence, I write a sentence. There's all kinds of things we can do to share that responsibility with children so that they come out feeling a little more confident about it. I'm going to pause again, and this will be a time you take a break, and I'll start again with section 3.